One of the things I wanted to say is that that I like about the project that this is about is that I expect you're going to find, if you haven't already, that so much that happens in our lives is serendipity. We didn't plan it. There's unexpected connections that are made. There's at this point it may look inevitable, but it was anything but. So. So I'm going to be slightly random here, if I could. And first of all, I want to go back to something that struck me as quite serendipitous. So again, I'm working in this remote community where a quarter to a third of the people actually live in town, are well educated, but the rest are subsistence gardeners in a village. It's that wonderful mix of things. So it looks very, very traditional when you're there, and the language is still strong and all this wonderful stuff. When I went back in '97 after an 11-year gap, people were happy to see me, and one of these things is in their language, when you go away, people say you've died. If you come back, they know that you haven't. So this is all reciprocity again. So when you really die, it's called imati timosa, you're really dead, and then just imati can mean just being away. Anyways, when I came back, I had a 9-year-old kid and told people about it, and they all wanted to send her a birthday present. And so I wanted to show you this. This is one of the birthday presents that was sent, and this really came as a surprise. These are people who don't have television. And, and yet here we are. So it's a small world. And Baka is my Maisin name. And I used to use that name in my classes until I noticed all the Japanese students giggling because Baka in Japanese means something like idiot. So I don't use it anymore. So on serendipity, one of the lines of questions was about jobs and about being here at UBC and other jobs I've had. And when I finished my PhD, it was very similar to this period now. There were virtually no jobs in anthropology, and it all looked pretty grim. And people would go to the American Anthropology Association meetings very depressed, and you might get one interview if you were lucky, and so forth. So it was pretty awful. And I remember going to a workshop there where I advised my students to do the same thing, where they basically, it was a workshop on how to get a job if you're an academic, basically. And it had to do with how to transform yourself into someone who would be hireable to, say, market researchers or in a business or in government. So I did that, and when I had my second postdoc, and that was about to run out, I had to really think seriously about alternatives and how to survive. And at that point, I really wanted to be an academic. But life is funny, and my wife and I had made really good friends with a harpsichord maker in Seattle, a very gifted musician and harpsichord maker. And at that point, he was working in one of the many computer shops that had spread up in Seattle in '84, '85 from that period. Was making a bare living from that and his harpsichords. But he had a good friend who had gotten a start in a startup software company, and got my friend Andy a job in the software company. And I met with some of their friends, and they talked about things that I could do, like writing manuals and everything else. And then I applied to UBC, and I got the invite to come up here, and I got the job. So I didn't go that route, and that would have been with the startup company called Microsoft. And I'd be very wealthy now, as are my friends. So it's funny how things work out. And I don't regret that choice at all. And it's been really good to be in touch with my friends who are not as in good health as I am, I would say, because the stress of their work is such, but are wonderful people. One of the great privileges we have as academics, and I hope continue in the future. It's very worrisome with so much contract work being going out. It's just the freedom to explore so many ideas and areas and so forth. So I feel incredibly privileged in that regard, that I can change to new topics and go to new areas, and that's more than acceptable. And that I can continue working with the same people over this long period of time and return and so forth, and that's acceptable too. That's a kind of luxury that very few people have, and I think we really need to acknowledge it before it's gone. So I got hired here at UBC in '87. It wasn't a very friendly place then, for whatever reason. The faculty didn't talk much with each other, and it wasn't that they were in fights with each other, they simply didn't talk to each other. One of the odd things about our location here at UBC is that we're on the edge of a rainforest. We're literally on the edge of a rainforest. So we're separated from the city. And where the restaurants and hotels are miles away from here. So people live miles away from here as well. And so there was especially in those days, there was very little mixing. So when I first came here, I think like every new faculty member who's come here since, one of my determinations was to make it a more socially friendly place. And we're still working on it, but I think it's gotten better. My other determination was that I didn't want to be the kind of person who only taught anthropology majors or graduate students and so forth. And so I think people had a sigh of relief when I volunteered to teach introductory courses, which I've been doing ever since. But I love doing them, and it's been so great because you get to meet students from very wildly different backgrounds and who take ideas to wildly different places. So that, in a way, has been, I think, really fortunate that so many of my colleagues don't like teaching intro, so I get to do it. So some of my teaching has been in that area. I've taught courses on the South Pacific. In a way, I was replacing Ken Burge, although nobody can replace him, so I also have taught in the anthropology of religion over the years, and had the chance to work with a wonderful, wonderful group of students through the years in this place. That's another kind of area of serendipity, I would say, because when I first came here, I had this notion that I would work with students who wanted to work in the South Pacific. And I've had one PhD who's worked in Papua New Guinea in my career. I've had a few MA students one of whom grew up in New Guinea and ended up doing her PhD there on at New Guinea, but not with me. She did her MA with me. So it's been a bit of a disappointment in some ways for doing it because of that, but it's interesting. Anthropology has shifted in many ways, funding, whatever, that people do not go to places like Papua New Guinea as much as they did anymore, even though once they get there, it's quite cheap to live, I tell them. And so I haven't had much of that opportunity, and I think you'll probably hear some of the same thing from other Melanesianists. So that also reflects a change in the field, change in geographic locations, topics, things of that nature that have been going on through the years. Oddly enough, because I work on religion, and we don't have, until recently, we didn't have anybody else who worked on religion, I've been able to work with students who work in areas that I never would have imagined myself getting involved in. And that includes David Geary, who's now an assistant professor at UBC Okanagan, who works in Bodh Gaya in India, the place where the Buddha received his enlightenment, where the Bodhi tree is and where a beautiful temple stands. And David went there to study the Buddhist pilgrim/tourism and so forth, from which I learned an immense amount. So I've learned about that, and I've got little souvenirs there that look like from Paris, like the Eiffel Tower. There's a little like Eiffel Tower thing of the temple from Bodh Gaya and stuff like that. So that opens windows. I have another student who studied racehorses in Kentucky and what happens to them in their afterlife again. I've got a student I'm working with right now who's going to study a Buddhist water park in a water slide park in Thailand. So another thing that's really quite special about the position that some of us get into is that we end up learning about things from our students that we never would have imagined learning, and kind of vicariously visiting parts of the world that we never could have imagined ourselves being in through their work. So that's wonderful. And it leads me to feel very grateful to my own mentors as well, who I was able to share my experience with. So this is kind of a paying forward, as they say. My former students come and ask me for letters, and they're apologetic, and I say, well, I was apologetic to David Aberley. And here's what David Aberley said to me. I was apologetic to Ruth Benedict. And it goes back through this genealogy. So I think that's pretty cool. And while I'm being rambling, if I can, I think another thing that's really cool with to remind students of is that anthropology is such a new thing in the world, and that we do pay a lot of attention to family lines and kinship, and that they need to know intellectually that they are part of family lines and kinship as well. So I teach history of anthropology courses at both the graduate level and undergraduate level. And one of the first things I do in those courses is to talk about genealogies and to point out that my mentor was Ken Burridge, his mentor was E. Evans Pritchard. Evans Pritchard was in Malinowski's seminar. Malinowski was inspired by James Fraser. So you're within 3 or 4 generations of the founders. And my other line is through David Aberley, Ruth Benedict, Franz Boas. I get the American side in as well. I can't get the French side in yet, which is frustrating. But that's kind of cool. It's kind of cool when students can start making those connections and seeing these people as connected. And by the same token, I came to UBC as a PhD student in 1979. This department was founded in 1948 by Harry and Audrey Hawthorne, actually. And one of the things that comes out of my work with T.F. McElraith was a knowledge of the history of Canadian anthropology that's pretty unusual back then and still pretty unusual. So I came in here knowing that this was the second anthropology department. We compete with McGill for that honor, but we are the second after Toronto. And that when Harry Hawthorne came here, he consulted with T.F. McElraith. They were friends. And so on and so forth. And so one of the things I've enjoyed being here too is to get a sense of the history of the place. So I'm glad this project's happening. I've learned an awful lot. My private discussions with Cyril Belshaw, who came here in 1953. So he's been here since nearly the beginning. And Ken Burridge, of course, who came in the late 60s. Robin Reddington, who came in the mid 60s. And so forth. So there's a lot of institutional memory in these places. One of my early projects was to write a history of the Department of Anthropology at Toronto that came out of my McElraith research. And I'd been a student there for 1 year and had taken a course from Norman Emerson, the archaeologist. And I didn't know this, but he left an unpublished manuscript on the history of the department, a very personal history. So his wife sent it to me. I can't quite remember how I got it, but I incorporated that into the stories as well of that place. So nobody's done anything quite similar here and many other places, but I think that the movement that Ragnar Darnell in particular is responsible for, of getting Canadian anthropologists and, anthropologists in Canada to be more conscious of their place and of the history of their place. I think it's really important. And it has a special significance here at UBC because we are on unceded territory, the Musqueam First Nation. So if you come to a talk here at UBC, there'll be an acknowledgement of that normally at the beginning, thanking the Musqueam people for their hospitality as we make use of their land, which has never been ceded to outsiders. That leads to a kind of consciousness in this place, which has been particularly strong in anthropology, but in other disciplines as well, that we are in a place where traditionally anthropologists travel to work. And it's not a distant, exotic place, it's people's home. And we are guests in their home. And that leads to a very different kind of understanding. So when I first came here as a graduate student, I didn't really know that. I came here to work with Ken Burge. When I came back as a faculty member in '87, I was more aware because I'd been doing this work on the Northwest Coast. And then when I started working on the McIlwraith book more and learning more about the history of Canadian anthropology, I came to better appreciate the importance of Hawthorne Tremblay. In that the major report on Canadian Native people, and to begin to realize that Hawthorne had been doing that kind of work since he was an MA student in New Zealand, that this was not something new to him that he brought here. So an applied focus in anthropology has been very much part of this place for a very long time. When I teach anthropology here, history of anthropology here, I always remind people that this place has a history and that it has a certain kind of culture in terms of responsibility for the local people. And I try to gently remind my colleagues of that too, because we don't always remember that. And I think it's important to have that sense of not just place, but of history and connection that goes through. So it's been interesting in my career here. I keep on discovering these connections with this place that I never would have imagined. So a few years later, I discovered that the founding collection in the Museum of Anthropology is oceanic. It's not Northwest Coast. It comes from the South Pacific. A lot of it comes from New Guinea. And that's because there was, I think he was a dentist, who took tours down there during the early 20th century and collected stuff and donated it to the university, and that became the core of the collection before they started to get the totem poles and the masks in afterwards. So that's been kind of interesting. It's been kind of interesting to walk around this building and find the remnants of the Second World War, the various gun emplacements and things like that. It's been interesting to know that there's still some Quonset huts here at UBC that were built during the Second World War when this was a major garrison. And it ties to my interest in New Guinea and the war and how important the war is in part of that part of the world as well, and how these remnants are around. And in those places are extremely important to people. So that's, again, it's just been a really privileged situation to be in, as opposed to working in a bureaucratic office at Microsoft where I could have been rich, to be able to explore, learn vicariously through other people, be exposed to new ideas, gain a better sense of place because I'm not moving from job to job or city to city. And I think that's becoming much more rare in this world. And I think that's sad, actually, in many ways. Much is being lost.